Welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burke and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our lecture today is sponsored by Speedway Properties. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. You can join by going to preservelincoln.org. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is a lifelong Lincolnite. His great-grandparents pioneered in Lancaster County in the 1870s. Jim has a bachelor's degree from UNL and operates J&L Lee Company, which is a publisher of regional books as well as the Coinery. He has written over 1,500 articles and books on Lincoln and Nebraska history. Jim serves on the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Commission and is also a founding member of the Preservation Association of Lincoln. This is a series of talks titled Jim McKee's Complete History of Lincoln, and this is program number 34. These programs are videotaped and shown on Link TV as well as on YouTube. Jim invites you to ask questions during the program. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
Trying to figure out why there are more people here today when the weather is rotten than there are. When we first conceived the idea of this series, which has been several years ago, I can't remember where, and we thought there would be, 8 or 10 in the series, something like maybe 12. One of the things that Eileen asked me to do was title it, and I titled it The Complete History of Lincoln. And I spelled it C-O-M-P-L-E-A-T, which nobody noticed until, maybe a year or two into it, and Jim Keck stopped me one day and he said, "What's with C-O-M-P-L-E-A-T?" And I said, well, I explained to him the difference. And years went by. And then last week, I got a call from someone on PAL, and they said, "We have been getting curious questions as to why you're spelling complete, C-O-M-P-L-E-A-T." So I explained to her, and then Tuesday, or yesterday it was, when I was at the Lincoln Journal, they get the postcard announcing this, as most of you probably do, and she said, "You have been misspelling the word C-O-M-P-L-E-A-T." Now we're talking about years have gone by, and finally people start to notice it. And she said, "So I checked with our editor to find out if it was correct." And he said, "No, that's not correct. That's an incorrect spelling of the word." And I said, "Well, the editor is unaware of the word C-O-M-P-L-E-A-T, which was a variant spelling and rather popular at one point in time. It's become almost completely archaic in England, interestingly, but is still used in the United States. And in the United States, it means quintessential, which has a nice ring to it, or maybe the totality. So suddenly, after all these years, people are beginning to read the postcard we've been sending out for. Interesting, at any rate. One of the topic we'll start with today is the Ag Campus. Why is it located where it is? We've talked a little bit about it before, and we will talk about it again probably some months down the road. But why is it located instead of where it was intended to be located? The land grant of 1862 is responsible for the University of Nebraska being a land grant institution, 1862, and it clearly stated in its intent that it was to teach topics related to agriculture and the mechanical arts. That was the primary thrust of the Morrill Act of the Land Grant Acts. The University of Nebraska, which was chartered in 1869, called for, of course, immediately, a College of Agriculture within the University of Nebraska and 5 others. So there would have been 6 colleges within the university system. It also provided that there would be 2 sections or 2 square miles of land set aside for the agriculture school's use on either college lands, that was specific land set aside in each township for schools, or on saline lands. Saline lands were specifically set aside from the earliest days of the United States, set aside to be owned by the federal government. So Capitol Beach is later going to become part of this question, was did the governor go astray when he actually sold off the land out there? It became Capitol Beach. And gosh, maybe 30, 40 years ago, the question came up, who actually had the land title to those? Did the federal government still retain it? Well, obviously, we worked that one out. The saline lands around here were primarily out around Pioneers Park, between Pioneers Park and the insane asylum or the regional center. That land in there is saline land. Then it becomes unsaline until we get down into the city of Lincoln. That's where salt really begins to enter into Salt Creek. If you go upstream from there, Salt Creek is freshwater, if you will. I don't suggest drinking it, but there are a lot of fish in it, for example. Then there's a saline area of lands around Capitol Beach Lake. Of course, all of the basin that Lincoln sits in was originally saline land. Then there was a saline tract of land of several sections of land, which I'll sort of describe to you as being between downtown Lincoln and the old fairgrounds, and I think you can kind of picture that in your own mind. Now the question was, would two sections of that land, because they immediately decided not to take any of the school lands out in the county, but rather the two sections of land which came between Lincoln and the fairgrounds, and I'm using that only as a point of reference, the fairgrounds wasn't there at that time. So they opened the university, keeping two sections of that land assigned to the university. However, even though they opened it, there was no College of Agriculture. It just simply did not exist. And there was a great debate at that time raging whether the College of Agriculture should be an experimental farm or should it be a demonstration farm. In other words, should it show you how to do things or should it be experimental in how things might be done in the future? Obviously, we end up with a little bit of both on the way. But still no college exists. However, a man named S.R. Thompson became chair of the School of Agriculture, even though no school existed. Some people then suggested that in order to prove to the federal government we were serious about having a College of Agriculture is that the main building, 11th and R Street roughly, be named the School of Agriculture, so that the federal government would think we were serious about it. Well, nothing came of that. But the moral act was sort of yes and sort of not being fulfilled. And then Mr. Thompson, dean of the school, was urged not to enter on his duties for at least 1 year. Although he is receiving salary and apparently teaching classes, it's not clear exactly what. It wasn't too big a deal for him, though, because no one had applied to the College of Agriculture, so it wasn't a problem. The following year, $1,000 was appropriated by the state government for the College of Agriculture, but the chancellor urged students not to apply. So never had to do that since, as far as I know. Still, they set aside this land, this 2 sections, 2 square miles of land, somewhere between downtown Lincoln. That's the best way to describe it, because they called it east of the railroad, which is kind of hard to get your arms around, but you realize that the railroad swings around and begins heading south. So it's kind of a general theory, at any rate. And they called it then, by later terms, near the fairgrounds. And they did set up a little bit of a farm operation down there, primarily with the growth of sugar beet raising and swine production. And even this early on, they were thinking about doing research in swine flu and swine diseases at that time. So they, needless to say, had quite a large farm and a number of buildings which were dedicated to the growing of hogs. People in Lincoln, people in the university didn't really give much of any thought to the College of Agriculture, except that particularly in the wintertime, the prevailing winds began to come out of the north, which meant that downtown Lincoln, and where most everybody lived, it suddenly became obvious that there was a hog farm out there. At that point in time, Roscoe Pound, the famous jurist of later years, is a student at the University of Nebraska. And although no one knew it at the time that it was he, it was some years later that it turned out Roscoe Pound, on his own, without telling anyone, stole the ROTC cannon. Doesn't sound like Roscoe either. He then moved it out to the experimental farm, if we can call it that, filled the cannon with crushed brick, and shot it into the swine research facilities, or the hog farm. And the newspaper the following morning said that the entire experimental station had been reduced to 1 load of bacon and 2 loads of kindling, which got everyone's attention. The regents did not miss the point, and they then quickly determined that no part of the Saline Land or any part that was given to them was really any good for the use at the university at all. So they sold a bunch of it for a little over $6,000. And in fact, they threw in some Lincoln City lots at the same time. Then in June of 1864, the regents purchased a half section of land from a man by the name of Moses Culver. And Moses Culver had a farm which in general went north from Holdridge Street, from 33rd Street to 48th Street, as far north as Dead Man's Run. And you can conceive that because that's where the campus sits today. And on that building, he sold it for around $55 an acre. So a pretty good bargain for everyone, $17,600. And they built a building on that site, which we see here. The Journal, the newspaper at that time, the Nebraska State Journal, as it was called, issued an editorial in 1878, shortly after that, saying that the regents should have held title to the fairgrounds near the city. They should have then sold the balance of the land and played off the amount that they had paid for the college farm, and that they should keep the 80 acres of land which had been fenced and was where the racetrack was located. Pretty clever thought, but it was completely ignored. In 1869, the first classroom was built that we see here, and it cost $6,900 just to build this rather elaborate 2-story building. Frame structure, which the following year or two was bricked over, so it had the appearance of a brick building, and it served many, many uses. When I was a little kid, and I can't tell you that I remember this, but during the years that I was a little kid, this building sat pretty much facing Holdridge, and this was where the original dairy store was. This is where, when I was a kid, for a nickel, you could go buy an ice cream cone. You can still buy an ice cream cone at the dairy store. It's moved a couple of times since then and is in the process of being reconfigured and moved yet again, but it's no longer nickel. And in fact, I think you can only get a double or a triple deck. You can't even get a single scoop of ice cream anymore. And instead of a nickel, it's a couple of bucks. So, but it's still a great bargain, one of the great bargains. That building was not torn down until 1973, which, when you get to be as old as I am, doesn't seem like that very long ago, and it cost way more to tear it down than it did to build it, quite obviously. 1899, the concept of the mall at the Ag campus was conceived, that sort of circular drive with buildings facing toward the center. They then built the first building on that mall, and it cost $27,500, the Agricultural Experimental Station, and that building is extant and the oldest building out there. Remodeled in 1959 and has been considerably changed even since then, the oldest building on the Ag campus. The big problem they had with the Ag campus originally was how to get the students there. Holdridge Street was still mud. There were no sidewalks. The trolley car, which ran from downtown Lincoln, ended at 27th Street, so you had to walk up to about 40th or something like that just to get there. And finally, in 1903, they put in sidewalks, so it was very difficult to get there. The University Bulletin during 1899 said that an educated farmer is to be envied, for he enjoys more privileges than any other man. Whoa, how about that? The agriculture student can also live on campus, right next to this building, literally to the east of it a bit, and find there a pleasant home. This is a quotation, by the way. Far enough from the city to be out of the way of its temptations to idleness and worse. Okay. During my 4.5 years at university, I looked constantly for the and worse, and never really encountered it. By 1877, the regents had determined that downtown building, which we have talked about quite frequently, what we'll call Old Main or Nebraska Hall, the original one, was literally impractical to repair, and that a new building should be built. And at that time, they investigated other campuses from other state universities. And at Michigan, they discovered what they thought the right answer would be. They suggested that an agriculture school should be developed with not less than 40 acres, if you can find them, and to move the university from downtown because this land is becoming not only encroached on all sides, but also more valuable. So the suggestion was made that we move the entire campus of the University of Nebraska to what I'll call originally the Ag Campus. It was promoted by Chancellor Avery. Avery Laboratory building still stands. And the regents joined the chimes to move the campus. In 1910, 1911, the legislature even appropriated a 1 mill levy to consolidate the two campuses on the East Campus site. It passed the Senate and failed in the lower house. 1914, they put it to a vote, the people of Nebraska, and it went down handily. They were not interested in having a second campus. Since 1974, the campus is known as the Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. I have to read it because it does not come trippingly out of my mind. Today, we call it East Campus. That's what I call it since 1964, roughly. But it also shares that campus with the College of Dentistry, the College of Law, the Barclay Center for Hearing, and married students' dormitories. Now, a guy has to wonder, wouldn't we have been better off to keep that original land than to sell it off? Because the university's literally bought it all back now, and we have student housing and other buildings on all that land between the fairgrounds. And in fact, now the university even owns the fairgrounds for the Innovation Campus. So maybe we would have been better off to just have kept it in the first place and not worried about it. Now I'll look at Lincoln's municipal buildings, of which this is, in a way, the first and also the first federal building at the same time, almost. As Lincoln began to develop in 1867, which is when Lancaster became Lincoln, as soon as it existed, the city offices were scattered here, there, and everywhere. Most all of them were in rented facilities, nothing that the city owned. In fact, City Hall was just in the second floor of a rented office building. The fire department was in an old livery barn about a half a block south of O Street. The jail was in a milk house, which was owned by Mr. Langdon, which was directly across the street to the west from where the Lincoln Journal sits currently. But as the city grew, they became interested in a block of land which was called on the maps of the day the historical block. It was a block bounded by 9th, 10th, Q, and R streets, and had been set aside by the Capitol Commission in 1867 as the site for the Nebraska State Historical Society. It had been given to the Nebraska State Historical Society for construction of a building. But unfortunately, the Nebraska State Historical Society did not exist as an entity, so they did not accept the land. And the city of Lincoln simply took it over. They simply moved in and took it over. And it became, first of all, a campgrounds, if you will, and they called it Market Square. And in fact, it was a Haymarket Square. It was never called that. They called it Market Square. The city scales were there, city campgrounds were there, and pretty much it became a parking lot for wagons, trading in hay, cattle, coal, horses, and produce. So it was sort of a Saturday morning farmer's market, and everything else rolled into one. By 1885, Lincoln's population had reached 40,000, and it became obvious that we needed a municipal building of our own, owned and built for the city. Then in April of 1886, a new building was proposed for the southeast corner of Market Square, and I think we're there we go, kind of out of sync there a little bit. And this building was built on what would be the southeast corner of the block, or the northwest corner of the intersection. Always a confusing way to look at it. This two-story building housed the city hall, the city council chambers, the police department, and the fire department, which had the greatest portion of the building, the lower portion, and part of it upstairs, where the mostly fire department was then volunteers, but the few paid members also lived upstairs or had rooms upstairs. The building was described as, and as you can see it here, elegant and substantial and arranged with a view to convenience. And yet that's the same building we're looking at. The fire department was pretty much the south half of the building. There were 15 firemen at that time that were paid. Everybody else was a volunteer. There was a hayloft on the second floor, a dining room, day room, and so forth. So most of the building is going to be the fire department. Then in 1906, backing up, I think, 1906, City Hall had been moved into this building in 1906, which had been built originally for the U.S. Post Office, Federal Courthouse, and U.S. Customs House, which I'm not sure exactly what they did in there. But in 1906, the City Hall moved out of that little building over into the federal building that we see here. That meant that the county health department is also going to move into that second building as well. But the balance of the block is still used by hay sales, the city scales, and so forth. Then in 1915, the first report was made on the city jail, which was also in that building. And they said that there were sometimes as many as 6 or 7, they called them guests, sleeping on one single bed in the one single cell that we had at that point in time. But the condition was not addressed. Then in the 1920s, the city decided that they wanted to clear the balance of the block of the farmers that were coming in there and setting up produce stands and so forth. They didn't know quite how to do this, so someone conceived of the idea that all we had to do is pass a resolution stating that if you are going to have any business in that block, that you must erect a permanent hitching post. Think of it as a parking meter. Well, this was impossible for somebody who was coming in on a weekend to sell produce or something like that. So in effect, it cleared off the other half of the block. By 1930, the population of Lincoln was just under 76,000. And at that point in time, also they shared the block, the fire department, police department, county health department, with the municipal coal yard and the municipal filling station. And of course, the municipal filling station is primarily going to move into a 2-story brick building at 1520 W. And you may not be able to wrap your mind around it, but part of that building is still standing. And there used to be a car repair facility in part of it, and a little antique mall in part of it, and the little antique mall part is still there. Think of it as being in the block directly to the east of the Lincoln Fire Station number 1, okay? And if you go down and look, you'll see this little brick building is still there. The Muni gas station was relocated, and the jail was moved in with the county jail on 9th and K Streets. And the city scales was moved to North 19th, and in 1940, this building then will be raised, and in its place will be this building, which I hope many of you remember. This became the city municipal court, primarily a police court, county city health, fire department, and police department. In 1961, the building was so badly damaged in a terrible rainstorm that police chief, then Joe Carroll's office, said he had to work somebody holding an umbrella over him, which kind of paints an interesting picture. So they began discussing, should we have a new specifically built county city building? And this is going to come around when it's approved by the voters in 1965, and they will break ground in the following December of 1966. So the new county city building will open in 1975. The old municipal building was built, this one was raised, and it became for a while a ground floor parking lot, gravel, and then it became the site of the Journal-Star printing company, not the newspaper offices, but the printing. So, and it looks, if you look at it, it looks like a brand new modern building. Unfortunately, the Lincoln Journal is no longer printed there. The Lincoln Journal is now printed in Omaha in conjunction with the Omaha World Herald, and being overseen by Lee Enterprises out of Des Moines. So just exactly what's going on there, we're not sure. But as the Lincoln Journal comes nearer and nearer to selling their property on 9th and P Streets, we'll see them move out of there as well. And we'll probably not next month, but in our down the road sometime, we'll talk about how the Nebraska State Historical Society, after it's formed, will come back on the city of Lincoln and say, hey, we want our square block of land that you simply stepped in and took. And we'll see how that plays out at that point in time. One of my favorite buildings has got to be this one. It's one that I learned early on was there and didn't know what it was. So the Old Stone School is what it was, in fact. During the first part of Lincoln's existence, there was almost no thought given whatsoever to educating the students. Remember, in 1867, the population of what we'll call the city was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 30. So educating the children was just not simply anything anybody thought about. But then the decision was made to locate in then Lancaster the Methodist Protestant Female Seminary, which will be built roughly, we'll call it, on the northeast corner of 9th and P. That's not the location because in the city of Lancaster, the streets were narrower and the blocks were narrower as well. So it actually would have been a bit north of that, but we'll call it that corner. That's where they will build the multi-storied stone Methodist Protestant Female Seminary building. Unfortunately, the population did not support a Methodist Protestant female seminary. In fact, they said that in the entire county there might have been 5 young ladies who could have availed themselves of the seminary, but chose not to. So it never developed. And the other thing we need to think about is the fact that a seminary we think of today as some sort of religious training. It was not. That was not the definition of seminary in the 1860s. The seminary, female seminary, was particularly what you might call a high school for girls. And it had no religious affiliation, or not training, I should say. It had a religious affiliation because it was going to be owned by the Methodist Protestant Church. But at any rate, they did not occupy it. There are reports that classes were held there. There is no evidence that they ever were. However, some of the people began to push for a school to be held in there for elementary school students in the city of Lincoln. And, in fact, one of the newspaper articles that said there was this, that the seminary started said that there were classes held in 1863 when the building had not even been finished. So we know that nothing ever happened there. But at any rate, in 1864, District Number 1 in the county was formed. It was a 6 square mile district, if you will. Then the following year, District 2 was formed. And at that point in time, the first classes really that we'll call a public school at all were probably held in John Cadman's dugout, which is still there as the basement of a house on West Calvert Street. There may have been a school to the south of there in what was called Sand Hill School out near Roca, but we really haven't got very much to nail it down. We'll talk about that a little bit more, maybe next time and maybe the time after that. But at any rate, as early as 1867 now, one of the gentlemen who was hired to teach at the seminary and got here with his wife only to find that there was no school, they approached his wife, Mrs. Merrill, and asked her to teach a small class of children in the school. She said she couldn't do it because she just had a baby. And they said, bring the baby to class. We don't care. And so she did offer grade school classes in the Methodist Protestant Female Seminary building. It was what was called a subscription school, in that she charged tuition. So it wasn't truly a public school in that manner, but it was open to all who wanted to attend. She not only brought her child to class with her, but the room she taught in, which was on the ground floor on the south side, which would have faced the south and had open windows. There was no glass in the windows. So what she did was in the wintertime, she hung rugs and carpets over the openings to keep the draft out. Unfortunately, the school existed probably for much less than a year, a few months, because the following spring, a flue got clogged in the building and the part of the building that was not masonry, the wooden part inside, burned. And the building literally burned out from the inside out. The school will stop, and a man will come in and take over the building and turn it into a hotel, which will be there for quite a while. Now, stepping aside from that, in 1867 as well, the city of Lincoln hired a man by the name of Milt Langdon, and Milt Langdon was the guy whose milk shed was the city jail across the street to the west from the Journal block. They hired him as a carpenter to build a schoolhouse on, listen to this, it's kind of tricky to get your arms around, north of the southwest corner of Block 27, opposite University Square. Now, University Square was the 4 square blocks, roughly 10-acre tract where the University of Nebraska is now located. Now, how can we visualize where that is? If you can visualize the block where the Lead Center sits, this would be in the southwest corner of that block, more or less. Okay, we'll get down to maybe where I can define it a little bit better. Okay, on November the 2nd of 1867, the newspaper said that it had hoped that the building, which was going to be 23 by 30 feet and facing south, would be completed and made of sandstone, and hopefully even be ready for occupancy later that month. In the meantime, it was announced also in the paper that they would have a dinner at the Methodist Church in order to support the school. Now, the Methodist Church was at that time located, think of the Journal Star office block. And you'll know that next door to it, to the east, is a little bank. And then if you think of the bank and you think north of that, there's a parking garage, which everybody uses in that area. That parking garage is the site of the Methodist Church. And the Methodist Church was pretty much on the corner, and it faced towards the east. A very small building, but this is where, for example, Governor Butler's reception was held, and this was kind of the official place to be. So they're going to have a dinner at the Methodist Church in support of the school. The newspaper said, "Bring your turkeys, chickens, puddings, pies, and let us have a gay time." They charged $1 for admission, which included the dinner, some speakers, and music after the event. We don't know how many people were there, but the net proceeds to the school was an amazing $85. So that's pretty darn good. The paper then reported that the people of Lincoln have at least demonstrated they know how to get up a big dinner. The old stone school building will be completed and opened. George Peck will be the teacher, and immediately he announces that he has 35 students, which is virtually the capacity of the school. By October of 1868, another school had opened in Lincoln, but it was a private school called a select school, and it was in the old Tingley Drugstore's second floor. The Tingley Drugstore we've talked about before, that was in a tiny little building on 10th Street, directly to the south of where the terminal building is today, and that's just an empty parking lot today. That's where Tingley's Drugstore was. So she also set up a little school. She charged, for the 12-year term, she charged $4 for primary students, $6 for commercial English classes, and $8 for higher math and Latin. So we kind of think maybe we can infer from this that these were the first high school classes taught, just because of the subject matter. We don't know whether anybody signed up for those classes or not, though, for sure, so we won't worry too much about that. By the next year, the school year 68-69, attendance jumped from 35 to 65. So the building is going to be immediately crowded. So at that point in time, the city will purchase the little Methodist Church building and use it as a elementary school as well. By 1870, the Lancaster County Superintendent of Schools made his first report to the state of Nebraska. He showed that the city of Lincoln had 2 public schools, the old Stone School and the school in the Methodist Church building. They said that the total value of the 2 buildings together was $3,000. and he noted that there was still one private school in attendance. By that time, there were 412 children of school age as part of the population, of which 236 attended school sometimes, with an average attendance of 178. So, not much of an emphasis still at that point in time. But as the city grew and enrollment grew, by 1870, we're going to pass, 1869, 1870, we'll pass a $50,000 bond issue to build a new school. And the question would be, should this new school be several small schools, or should it be a proper, quote, high school all by itself? And at that point in time, Charles Gear, the editor of the newspaper, wrote an editorial saying that he thought it should be one high school building, that they should not build a bunch of smaller ones. He said it would not hurt any healthy child of a dozen years to walk half or 3/4 of a mile to school. The children of Lincoln are not so physically degenerate that they cannot get to a school located anywhere near the center of town without endangering their health or wearing out their youthful energies. All right, he was. The Central School carried the ballot 151 to 60, so total. But now, the old stone school then is going to become the Lincoln's Municipal Jail for a time. Its footprint will live on. The address of the building is going to be indeterminate because it faces the south, but it's actually located on the east-west alley. So it's not on the corner, even though it faces, and it faces for a time an open lot or the corner, and then later, 1927, a building will be built interceding, and it will be the Salvation Army building. The Salvation Army will build the building. They will be in residence there. Then they will attach it to the building, which we see here. We're in the alley, and we're looking towards the southwest. So the building, which is the most indescribable building, it's been stuccoed over because this stone that we're going to be using is very poor quality. In order to get it to last at all, we're going to more or less stucco over it. Really a pug-ugly building. And I did take interior. Let's go ahead. Here's the Salvation Army on the building on the corner, which you may remember. This is now looking at the building. This is the west elevation. So we're looking towards the east in this picture. Maybe you remember, to the right in this picture is the Salvation Army building. The buildings were conjoined at the hip. And at that time, for a brief time, I worked at Nebraska Bookstore. And the FOE Eagles had taken over the Salvation Army's building. And I could tell we were getting ready to tear this building down because one of the employees at Nebraska Book, her husband was the head eagle, or whatever they called him at that time. And I knew the building they were vacating it. So I went over and decided to take some pictures, and I do have a couple of interior pictures. I didn't get them into the program, unfortunately. And when I went inside, I was met with a guy that was ready to physically throw me out because I had my camera with me, and I think he thought I was going to make problems for him. But I explained it was his wife that I knew, so pretty soon I was his best friend. And he took me then into the basement of the Salvation Army building, and from then into the basement of the Old Stone School. I have pictures of the foundation, the building inside, nothing left of the schoolrooms upstairs. It's been divided into apartments, which were still being used in the early 1970s, that building. Really a piece of junk, but the building was still there, the original Old Stone School, although you could hardly tell it from the exterior. Next, of course, we're going to tear down everything on that block to make way for the Lead Center. First of all, we'll tear down the buildings along the south edge, which will be the Eagles building, Salvation Army building, the school, University Publishing. There was a mortuary in there. Those will all be gone first. And again, from the perspective looking at it from the back room of Nebraska Book, I looked out one day And the University Publishing was a nice brick, three-story building. And they had one of those great big cranes with a ball on it, and they had pulled that sucker back, and that ball was hitting the building, and huge clouds of white smoke, dust, were going from that building, just covering downtown Lincoln. And I thought, that building must have been full of asbestos. And of course, I had no standing in the question, but I went and asked, and I discovered an interesting flaw in the law at that time. Because it was a state building, they didn't have to do any mitigation at that time for the asbestos. So we sent it down over downtown Lincoln. But the building was torn down. After it's gone, this is looking over the site towards the back of what was then Kimball Recital Hall. So we're looking in this picture pretty much towards the north. Kimball Recital Hall, now you can get that in your mind, and you can see where this building was located on that block. And the Lead Center was built kind of around Kimball and attached to it in some ways. And that's what we have there today, the Kimball, or the Lead Center, okay? The Oddfellows. Well, the Independent Order of Oddfellows sometimes claim to go back to biblical times, but probably they date more like to 1745, which is not quite that early. It was a group in England which primarily met in taverns. Sound like a fine bunch of people. And each one of the attendants would pay a penny each time they attended a meeting. And you can think of it like a fraternal organization if you want to. And any brother, who they were called, if any brother needed anything, they would tap into this fund, which began to develop as they accumulated pennies. Difficult to think of, but at that time, for a penny, you might be able to get a hotel room. You might even, in a lesser hotel, get your horse boarded. So a penny was not a totally insignificant amount of money at that time. And penny, well, I think about the size of a $50, weren't they, Matt? Something like that. Yeah, a penny. So it was not what we think of today. The term Oddfellows is hard to know exactly how it came about, for sure, but it was said at the time that it was odd for common laborers, who are the people who came to these meetings, to associate for a common good, and that they were like a guild, but they weren't of a stature of a guild. So they claimed, as they progressed, to be organized to visit the sick, relieve the distressed, and bury their dead. That's when they became the IOOF, Independent Order of Odd Fellows. But they were not thought of, as we think of later, as an insurance organization like the Woodmen of the World or something like that, not a fraternal organization of insurance. The IOOF came to the United States, to New York in 1806, and they were formally organized in 1819. And then they came west in 1835. St. Louis had the first Oddfellows there. The year before Nebraska became a territory, so 1853, just as it was about to become legal to settle here, a man by the name of Alfred Jones crossed from Iowa into Nebraska, and his idea was he wanted to start the first Oddfellows Temple in Nebraska. So he went into what would later be the area of Omaha and found where he wanted for a site. Now, at that time, you needed to have 5 people in order to start a lodge. So he had the 5 people in Iowa. Just about 1854, when the territory becomes official, one of them drops dead. So he only has 4 people, which enables a man in Nebraska City to actually start the first IOOF lodge within Nebraska. He becomes number 2. Originally, they will meet in 1855 in the little brick building which was built by the Omaha Ferry Company, which is also the first territorial capitol building. With 1867, with the Capitol Commission, square blocks, square lots in Lincoln, I should say, are set aside by the Capitol Commission for the use of churches, fraternal organizations, schools, and so forth. Churches basically got 3 lots fraternal organizations got one lot. And all you had to do was apply. Anybody that applied that met the requirements would get either 3 lots, 1 lot, or whatever. Lots at that time were offered to the ancient free accepted Masons, the Order of Good Templars, and the IOOF, but none of them accepted because none of them was officially organized at that point in time. However, Odd Fellows, which were called Capital Lodge number 11, so the 11th IOOF hall in Nebraska, met above Tingley's Drugstore, which we just talked about, that same site. That's where they met in 1868. 7 days later, the Masons met in the same hall, and literally every fraternal organization started there and then immediately moved out to other quarters. The Odd Fellows, among their first members, were the governor, Governor David Butler, the Secretary of State, Thomas Perkins Kennard, Stephen Pound, and Luke Lavender. So the people who started Lincoln were all members of the IOOF. And in fact, literally every man in the city would be a member, not of one fraternal organization, but 2 or 3 or more. This was how they got, particularly if they were a professional man, they got out into the community, people knew them and what services they offered and so forth. So it was not just a way, since they didn't have football games on TV, to get out, but also to promote themselves, if you will. By 1874, there were 5 different fraternal societies meeting at the hall on the south side of O between 10th and 11th Street. My favorite was the Improved Order of Red Men. A quote, "They kindled their council fires the first Thursday in every moon at their wigwam." What became of the Red Men? I don't know. May 3rd of 1881, the Odd Fellows, now well established and in business, can no longer get the free lot that they had promised. So instead, they're going to purchase a lot on the northeast corner of 11th and L. The following year, they will begin construction of the building we see here, which they announced 3 stories tall, would cost $20,000 to build and would cost another $5,000 to furnish. So a good building. It incorporated, or rather housed, several IOOF chapters. Chapter 11, Lodge, Lancaster Lodge, number 39, and Germania 67. This was an entirely German-speaking branch of the IOOF. And they all met on the upper floors of this building, and on the lower floor of the building, as were opera houses in any city that was lucky enough to have one, the lower floor would be where they would rent out rooms in order to have an income to support their lodge hall on the upper floors. By 1909, there were 300 Oddfellow chapters within the state of Nebraska. They then started in York in 1909, a huge building. If you look at the pictures of it, it was a home for indigent Oddfellows, which cost $100,000 to build for needy wives and children. At the time they built that, their little brochure said that at that time, one of their members was Vice President Schuyler Colfax. That's also when they instituted a new group called the Rebeccas, which was the wives or the women's auxiliary. And Eleanor Roosevelt promoted the wives, the IOOF. In 1966, this building was becoming pretty tired. This is what it looked like. I gave a program up there probably in this period of time, 1965. And you entered the lodge hall by going in a door on the south side, and a staircase went directly upstairs. And I thought when I went up there, this building looks like it could fall down at any time. It really was in pretty poor shape. So it was in 1966 that they sold this building. It was torn down and it became a gravel parking lot, as often happens for a time. Then later a parking garage will be built on that property. And it will extend over a block and into a parking garage, and then over a block and into the Cornhusker Hotel. Then they sold this building to become the parking lot. The IOOF took the money that they got for selling their lot and the building, which the building was worth nothing. They then bought lots on North 56th Street. I don't know what the address is, would be across the street west from the Lutheran High School junior high, and grade school. And they built there a 2-story cement block building for all of the local IOOF chapters. The attendance at the IOOF, like literally every fraternal organization, is on a steady path downward. I spoke there maybe the last time was in the 5 to 10 years, no, let's say 5 years ago bracket. And I would say the average age of a member of the IOOF last time was about 147, I think. And they were fading fast. That building is now for sale. Last I knew, it's been for sale for a year. So what can I say? Clay. There's an opportunity just waiting. If you always wanted to have a fraternal building, well, I bet it could be had very inexpensively. Through the years, the IOOF, which, as I said, is sort of slowly going out of business and closing its ranks, have a number of buildings still extant around the state. 2 of them are on the Historic Register of Historic Places. They had homes for children, the elderly, recreation areas along the highways, and iBank is what they supported in their last campaign. John Cadman's house. We talked about that just very briefly a minute ago when I said that perhaps the first school in what we'll call the city of Lincoln was held in the basement of this house. It's not exactly true, but we'll see why. And we're not positive that it wasn't here and not at the Sandhill School. But when the Oregon Trail cut off, which connected the original Fort Kearny, which we call Nebraska City, with Fort Childs, which we call Fort Kearny, when the trail which connected Old Fort Kearny and New Fort Kearny, might be an easier way to think of it, came through Lancaster County. This was a very critical trail, and it was considered to be the heaviest traveled portion of the entire Oregon Trail. Very bizarre, because the Oregon Trail itself came up through Kansas, Fairbury, and took an angle and then headed to New Fort Kearny. This trail had more traffic on it because at that time the cheapest, fastest, easiest way to travel was by water. So the federal government, using this theory, taking its troops, mail, and supplies westward, would go as far as they could go by water and then head west. So the stop-off point was Nebraska City. And this is where we also find, near Nebraska City at the little village of Wyoming, this is where a great many of the Mormons also crossed the river and went west. We think of them as going from up above Omaha at Florence and winter quarters, but a great many of them crossed and used this same trail. This trail is on the path of an old Indian trail. The Indian Trail became the Oregon Trail cut off, if you will, and later will become a railroad, Midland Pacific Railroad. I think we may have talked about that the last time we were here. And today we call it Highway 2, pretty much. It's not exact, but pretty much. So this crossed Salt Creek relatively near and a little bit to the north of Saltillo, the village of Saltillo. And if you can imagine this area, between Saltillo Road and Roca Road, there were a number of trail crossings, and it was all one trail, but they crossed the creek in maybe as many as half a dozen places along there. Sam Van Pelt spent years trying to map each these sites, and he did get a lot of them noted, so we do know approximately where they were. John Cadman wanted to have a stage station. Well, he had a stage station there at one of these crossings, and he wanted his crossing to be the primary one. And the reason the crossing of the creek kept changing was all of these trails came up from Nebraska City were dirt trails. And when you would cross the creek, it became not as deep a creek, obviously, as it is now, considerably less deep, but it would become muddy. So John Cadman suggested to each wagon as it left Nebraska City, throw a rock or two on board. When you get to my crossing, throw the rock out. And as inconceivable as it could sound, hundreds of wagons every day, many hundreds some days, each throwing off a few rocks, soon fabricated a stone crossing of Salt Creek. This is the primary crossing. We can still find it, and it needs to be done in the early spring when there's a little bit of ice, because we can still find that stone crossing. But at any rate, that's where John Cadman established a stage station. Now, a stage station, as we have talked before, is kind of like a rest area on the interstate where you have a clover leaf. You would have a place where you might be able to spend the night. You would be able to always get fresh water. There would be a well. There would be a place where you could trade, if you had a lame ox, it was a used ox lot, you could borrow a new ox. So you might also be able to get some form of food and maybe even some supplies. This is what John Cadman established at that point. And he will move his home from at that point towards the north to what today we call Calvert Street. That first called Ponca Street, then the Old Cinder Road and Sizer Street. Today we call it Calvert Street. And his house was built there. We see the house here as it looked in 1882, and here as it looked in 1947 as it begins to deteriorate. Sometime in the 1950s, the upper floor was torn off, but the portion of the house, which was the basement, dug into the side of the hill and made of stone, was where the Capital Commission stayed when they examined the village of Yankee Hill as a potential capital site. And it's here, too, that we think the first school may have been held in this building. A stone dugout with more or less a sod roof over it. Still there. Roughly, the address is not easy to determine, but probably a roughly 555 West Calvert Street. And if you get down into that area and find your way into that area, you'll see it's the only house extant, as far as I know, on the south side of West Calvert, between First Street and what is that Valley View Highway or whatever that runs Highway 77. And I'm told that we will not be able to finish this topic because we have used up all our time. We were going to hopefully do 5 topics today, and we will not even complete the third one. So obviously, John, you don't need to hurry on those slides because we got plenty left for another time or two. We'll be back next month to pick up this particular topic and finish it out. And that leaves us time, I think, for a few questions, if you have any. Beth Ann.
I have a question. If we think about Iowa, Colorado, Oklahoma, their state universities were in separate cities. Their land-grant schools, University of California, Davis, usually they had veterinarian schools. So how was it that everything related to the land-grant part of Nebraska and the university system, they were both co-located in?
Okay. I will try to rephrase that for the tape. The question is, why in Nebraska did we have all of the state schools, including the agriculture school? If we had had a veterinary school, it would have been here and so forth. Instead of scattering them around the state of Nebraska, why do we have all of the state schools, or did we at that time, in the city of Lincoln? Now it's changed a bit. And the reason is really rather simple. We're going to move the capital from the territory in Omaha. We're going to move it to the village of Lincoln. Remember, population 30. We have to then create a town to support the state. And the Capital Commission's thought was that in order to support the capital function, we not only need to have the state capital in Lincoln, we need to have the university here, we need to have the state insane asylum here, and we need to have the state penitentiary here in order to form enough of a nucleus to build a state capital and populate it. So that's the answer. It was all brought to Lincoln at that point in time, but as things change, we add the school at Curtis, which becomes an agriculture school. We pick up the schools at Kearney, Chadron, and so forth, Peru, as part of the state system. But initially, we put them all in Lincoln to make a community that would be self-supportive. Another question. And I think now I'm getting the sign that we have signed off for another time. And we will be back here next month. We'll finish up John Cadman and take up other topics. The next topic after this one, by the way, is when the Liberty Bell visited the city of Lincoln.